So good afternoon and welcome to the 2014 Timbers Lecture. My name is Lucas Swain. I'm an associate professor here in the government department, and I'm a member of Dartmouth's legal studies faculty. The Timbers Lecture is an endowed lecture that's part of Dartmouth's Daniel Webster Fund. Its purpose is to support speakers and conferences on topics relating to the law, ethics, and public policy. The lecture was established at Dartmouth in 1995. It's named in honor of Judge William H. Timbers, an alumnus and a member of the class of 1937. Judge Timbers was a highly regarded lawyer and judge of the U.S. District Court for Connecticut, and then subsequently judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Since its creation, the Timbers Lecture has been delivered by such notable figures as Martha Nussbaum, Thomas Penfield Jackson, Stephen Morse, Dennis Thompson, and Will Kimlicka. I should note that the 2014 lecture is co-sponsored by the Rockefeller Center, by the Dartmouth Lawyers Association, and by Dartmouth's legal studies faculty. And indeed, I'd like to thank Professor Sonu Bedi, who is chair of legal studies faculty and with us today, for bringing together this occasion, and also Joanne Needham for her help in organizing today's lecture. This year, we are honored to have, as our Timbers lecturer, Professor MichaelMoore. He is Charles R. Walgreen Jr. University Endowed Chair at the University of Illinois. He's also Professor of Law, Professor of Philosophy, Professor in the Center for Advanced Study, and co-director of the program in Law and Philosophy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's an expert on legal theory. He's an expert on criminal law, on causation and the law, among various other things. And he's lectured widely. He's held professorial positions at several universities. And indeed, he was a member of the Law and Neuroscience Research Project under the auspices, of the MacArthur Foundation from 2007 to 2010. He's published a series of important articles in leading academic and legal journals, and Professor Moore has written a number of highly influential books. These include a book entitled Act and Crime, The Philosophy of Action and Its Implications for Criminal Law, a book entitled Placing Blame, A General Theory of the Criminal Law from 1997, and most recently, Causation and Responsibility from 2009. That book's received considerable attention. It's had symposia dedicated to it in Rutgers Law Journal and in academic journals such as Legal Theory and in Jurisprudence and so forth. His lecture today is entitled Mechanical Brains and Responsible Choices, Challenges of Neuroscience to Responsibility. Please join me in welcoming to Dartmouth, MichaelMoore.
Is this mic on? Sounds like it. Thank you, Lucas, for that generous introduction. It is really nice to be back here in Dartmouth. I see a number of old friends in the audience, including my, what is the title? Uncle-in-law, is that what you are, David? A chair in chemistry for more years than I've been teaching, and his wife, Lee. My partner in crime for the MacArthur Foundation, Adina Roskis from the philosophy department, and a variety of new friends that I've met today at the Rockefeller Center. I was interested wandering around the Rockefeller Center today on the issues of public policy, law, ethics, and the like. You people deal with the issues in which I spend most of my professional life as well. Talking about things like the gay marriage issue that the Supreme Court ducked this week, and its great chance to strike a blow for Millie and liberty, which it didn't strike except by not doing something and therefore leaving it intact. My advice to various intelligence agencies about when it's ethical to torture. My students came up to me the other day and said, I hear you're an expert on torture. I said, no, I don't know how to do it. I just know when to do it. That's my advice. The Obama administration, targeted killing, all those are great issues of public policy. My lecture today is actually about a presupposition of those kinds of issues in public policy, law, and morality. Namely, are we the kind of people we have to be for those to be the fair norms of morality by which we're judged or of legality by which we're punished or rewarded? What kind of people have we to be? There is a psychology presupposed by the law, which has increasingly come under fire by the brain sciences of today. It's interesting, the arguments don't differ that much from the arguments when I started in the 60s, which were Freudian arguments. The same kinds of arguments, the science is better, and they're getting taken more seriously. I put this quote, I hope you all have the libretto for this opera in hand. I'm going to try to talk about an impossibly large number of things, so this might make it quicker. In any event, the New York Times, just a year ago in its op-ed page, characterized what it took many people to think coming out of contemporary brain sciences, namely conclusions like human beings are nothing but neurons. Once we understand the brain well enough, we will be able to understand behavior. We will see the chains of physical causation that determine actions. We will see that people don't really possess free will. Their actions are caused by material processes emerging directly out of nature. Neuroscience will replace psychology and other fields as the way to understand action. That last sentence reminds me of the director out in Santa Barbara, who used to teach here for many years, Mike Gazzaniga, who used to say, neuroscience will conquer the law. We will own you. Kind of reminded me what Khrushchev did at the United Nations with his shoe, right? We will bury you. Well, that's the kind of challenge to which any good legal theorist or philosopher has to respond. Will, in fact, it turn out to be the case that the presuppositions we have about what makes a legal system, the kind of legal system that we liberals, in a large sense, are proud of, are those presuppositions going to be shown to be false by neuroscience or not? It is an interdisciplinary topic. It's about law. It's certainly about philosophy, ethical philosophy, and the philosophy of science. It's about medicine broadly construed, particularly neurology and neuroscience, and about psychology, both folk psychology and academic cognitive psychology. I've got two official hats. I have tenure in two of those fields. I did visit in a neurology department once, and that does get me professional courtesy when I go in for eye exams and things. Information processing. So I got a limited sort of background there. I still do grand rounds at various medical schools. I was just down in Australia at the John Curtin School for Medical Research doing a grand rounds down there as well. So I've been dabbling with the docs for quite a while on the brain sciences. And in terms of psychology, I'm sure David thinks it's my screwed up family that just makes me so introspective, but actually I've had an academic interest there for a long time as well. I started in the 60s. One of my first papers was on Freudian dream theory, unpacking it so it could be testable, and if tested, verified or falsified, mostly falsified as it turned out. So I've been interested in philosophical psychology for a long time. I'm going to talk about four things. That's the organizational setting at the beginning. The first is what it is that's being challenged by the brain sciences of today. The second is what's doing the challenging. What are the data, if you like? Out of the vast number of things we're discovering, which ones, at least by popular consensus, are the ones taken to be most challenging of responsibility? Thirdly, can we do better than the New York Times that I just quoted in parsing the challenges? There are distinct challenges, I think, mixed together. In fact, I think there are four sorts of distinct challenges mixed in that editorial that it's helpful to separate. I mean, you remember Caesar, divide and conquer. Actually, it's just clarity. Namely, I think those are different challenges and have to be separately addressed. There are four of them in my more dramatic moments. I'm thinking of calling the book, of which this is an overview, The Four Horsemen of the Neuroscientific Apocalypse, but I doubt that my editors at Oxford are going to let that one go. It's probably going to be Mechanical Brains and Responsible Choices. It is Oxford Press, so if you intend to buy the book, start saving now, and you'll have enough money by the time it actually comes out. Okay, what is being challenged? Three things. Start at the, as the neuroscientists like to say, top down. Start at the very top. What kinds of legal institutions are the ones that seem to be threatened? Adina and I sat in on a lecture by Robert Sapolsky years ago from Stanford, the biologist. And he was picking on retributive justice as something that neuroscience was going to show was completely false and had to be eradicated from the criminal system. That's certainly one of the things many people think is vulnerable to the insights of an advancing science. The view that we punish people in the criminal law because and only because they deserve to suffer for their culpable wrongdoing, Kantian retributivism. What I think Sapolsky didn't realize is how broad his targets actually are. Whole ranges of law have what I call justice-soaked aspects to them. So the entitlements of property, if they're given on a non-utilitarian basis, either the natural rights of John Locke or the less popular version of Hegel, that's a justice view of property allocations. Civil recourse in either promissory or non-promissory cases, thought to be two different kinds of corrective justice since Aristotle to the present day. Not of the incentive effects of various economists, but rather backward-looking justice theories of civil recourse in either contracts or torts. Progressive taxation, on John Rawls' theory of distributive justice, a matter of justice, not a matter of social utility calculated in the utilitarian calculus. All of those modes of legal arrangements require that there be some justice underlying those legal institutions, or their rationale has to be changed. Now, there are people like Steven Pinker, the well-known psychologist at Harvard, who think that all of those justice theories are simply bad names for disguised utilitarianism. Utilitarian philosophies, it is well known as a social philosophy, is easily shown to be compatible with any of the insights of neuroscience we're going to talk about. But what's not easy to show is what Pinker and his ilk want to say, which is really the Rawlsian theory of distributive justice, the Kantian theory of retributive justice, Aristotle's theory of corrective justice, Locke's theory of natural right, they're all disguised forms of utilitarianism, usually thought of as a kind of two-step utilitarianism or sometimes indirect. There's a nice literature on that. Without going into the detail, the bottom line of that literature is not a chance. Justice theories of law will not reduce to utilitarianism, so you can't have what I call on the outline cheap compatibilism. You don't get off that easily by saying, well, utilitarianism as a social philosophy really underlies the legal institutions, and that is easily shown cheaply to be compatible with the insights of neuroscience. We need the morality that underlies the law, the morality of justice of various kinds, to be shown to be compatible, to have an interesting discussion. But that is, I think, the discussion that needs to be had once you see that we do not have purely utilitarian justified legal institutions. So the second thing, beyond those institutions of law, is the morality itself that is part of the law through these justice theories. What kind of morality is that? It's the morality of personal agency. The morality that says each of us is a moral agent capable of holding both rights and exercising them, including waiving them, and responsibilities. I see I've been assigned just last week to teach criminal law, which I haven't taught for a long time, next semester. What I tell my criminal law students is this: all Western criminal law could be learned from Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Voluntariness of action, the nature of the causal relations between action and the harms that morality and the law prohibit, the accountability of agents, the culpability of states of intention or predictive belief with which actions are done, the kinds of excuses, which Aristotle divides into two, between compulsions and cognitive excuses of ignorance and mistake, the justifying circumstances that make not wrong what is otherwise prima facie wrong. It's all there. That is the morality that underlies the institutions of justice and has for 2,000 years of legal system from the Greeks pretty much straight to us. The third thing that is threatened is the psychology that morality presupposes. It presupposes we are beings with certain quite determinate characteristics that make it fair to apply those kinds of norms of justice and the legal norms built upon them to creatures like us. Now, how you package that psychology we could spend enormous amounts of time on. Post-World War II philosophy of mind, philosophy of action did. Let me give you down and dirty my big five. 5 attributes of common sense psychology that characterize the psychology we need to be the morally responsible agents we think we are. First up, intentionality with a capital I. The directedness upon an object that the scholastics in the Middle Ages worried so much about, revived in our own time, late 19th century, by Brentano in Psychology. You don't just intend or desire or hope or fear simplicatur. You desire that something be the case, intend that something be made the case, believe that something is the case. What follows the that of those operators is what's called the content, the intentional content of states. So first aspect of the psychology, we operate under representations of the world that we think of as intentional content, which has a logic that is peculiar to itself. Intentional with a capital I, logic. Second supposition, I put on the outline a nod to Plato, the three parts of the soul. It's as modern as modern cognitive psychology. Namely, there are three representational states of all the ones there are, which there are quite a few. Three kinds of them that are most relevant to our moral agency. Three modalities of our representation. One, how we want the world to be. Two, how we believe it is. And three, as we intend to make it. What are usually called the motivational, the cognitive, and in the old language, the conative modalities of representation, or these days in philosophy called the BDI psychology, belief, desire, intention, psychology. There are three representational states that are particularly important to us as moral agents. Second supposition. Third supposition about what we're like is that these states are ordered in the way that since Aristotle we have thought of as practical rationality. There are content relations between what you believe, what you want, and what you intend, by virtue of which you act rationally. So on a generous interpretation of your motives in coming to this lecture, you wanted to learn about something about neuroscience and responsibility. You believed they wouldn't bring in anybody who didn't know anything about it so that you would learn something if he speaks okay. And you intended, therefore, to come, and therefore you came. BDI psychology. There is a relationship between the content of what you wanted, what you believed you would achieve through action, what you intended, and how you acted that makes you a rational agent. Those are not inviolable norms. I was recently testifying before the Norwegian Parliament about Mr. Breivik, the guy who killed 89 teenagers on the island south of Oslo. He thought some very peculiar things, and his reasoning from those things wasn't all that great either on certain occasions. He thought he was a member of an organization that hadn't existed for 1,000 years and that he was the chief and that they had had meetings. Cognitively, there were some deficits. Some people, like a famous artist, cut off his ear to be a better artist. The means-end calculation seems a little bad. Mr. Hinckley, you may recall, wanted a date with Jodie Foster, so he shot the president. I don't know how that was supposed to work, but nonetheless, there are deficits of reasoning. Third supposition, most of us, most of the time, don't operate like that. We are infallible virtually with regard to simple practical syllogisms. Fourth suppositions, it's not just that they stand in a certain order, but they are, as David Hume said, causally efficacious. Important to common sense psychology is that we have the capacity to make the world bend to our will, that our intentions can indeed issue in the world changing the way that we intend it to change. Not all the time. You can't click your heels 3 times and get back to Kansas, as in the famous film. But nonetheless, there are things you can do that actually make the world as you will it to be. The world is, in part at least, causally responsive to those practical reasonings that end in intentions. Fourth supposition. Fifth supposition. The second sort of magical characteristic about minds, in addition to intentionality, is the fact that with human beings there is consciousness. Consciousness typically means, I think, 4 things to people as they explore it. One is what philosophers call qualia, the phenomenological feel of conscious experience, the Joycean stream of consciousness sense. But secondly, and almost as importantly, it's also a form of privileged access. You know your own mind. This is not experiential, this is cognitive. You know your own mind in the way you don't know the mind of others. The psychologies that used to deny that, like behaviorism, gave rise to this kind of joke. One behaviorist sees the other on the street, and he opens the conversation with, "You feel fine, how do I feel?" If there were no privileged access, that wouldn't even be moderately amusing. It seems like we have privileged access to the contents of our own mind. So you have phenomenological feel, privileged access. Thirdly, reflexivity, namely consciousness can be consciousness of itself, self-consciousness. And fourthly, much explored by Locke in his view about consciousness and memory, we constitute our sense of self through the continuity of consciousness both at a time. We're not like the split brain patients that Mike Gazzaniga made his name studying here at Dartmouth. And we're not like a few, at least, of the multiple personality patients who have co-conscious centers at the same time. Our consciousness seems, at least to us, to be experienced as unified. And over time, we don't have the kind of memory lapses that multiple personality people typically do have between different periods of their life. We experience our past and our future selves as the same self as we are. So 4 aspects of consciousness that themselves are worthy of comment. Put them all together, you have a complex psychological picture of the kind of beings we are, on which our morality is based, and thus the legal institutions, to the extent they are justice-drenched institutions as I depicted, is also based. So that's what's being challenged, if you like, by the neuroscientific data. What's doing the challenging? There's a vast amount of data out there. It's really a hard thing to think about summarizing. When I did my grand rounds last week at the John Curtin School, I was absolutely astounded that those who follow in the footsteps of John Eccles, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering in the late 40s the chemical as opposed to the electrical basis on synaptic firings, the level of detail of their understanding of the moving of a single vesicle across a single synapse at a single site on a single neuron is absolutely astonishing. We've progressed enormously. How do you sift through all that data? Well, in my case, just let what popularly is taken as challenging do the sifting. So let me give you 3 clumps of data, generously construing both clumps and data. First clump. The mind enables the brain enables the mind is one of my favorite sayings from one of Adina's and my colleague Stephen Moore's. The brain enables the mind. That's code for, I don't know what the relationship is, but there's some kind of intimate relation. Starting with what I gather is somewhat of a local hero around here, Phineas Gage, the railroad guy who was 10 miles away when he was tamping down the explosives in the hole that was drilled so they could have a cut for the railroad, and he hit with his spark the explosive, and it sent the tamping bar up through his left frontal lobe and wiped out a bunch of his left frontal lobe, and who afterwards had, as described by his local doctor here, significant behavioral changes and changes of mood, affect, and other mental changes as well. Has to be, even this was 1848, has to be some intimate relation between mind and brain for there to be that kind of damage to physical structure, brain, and that kind of corresponding change in mental experience and in the initiation of different kinds of actions. Second kind of example is also a very familiar one in popular, as I see it, literature. It actually was an individual who came to the University of Virginia Hospital when I was teaching there in the late 90s. An individual who had been arrested for improper sexual conduct with his 14-year-old stepdaughter. He reported truthfully that he had never done this before. He had never had any kind of urges of this kind before. He had never looked at child pornography before, and he was doing all of those things. The judge who looked at him thought maybe there's something a bit peculiar about him, sent him over to the UVA hospital. The neurology department did a workup and found a very large right orbital frontal tumor. Not usually associated with those kinds of behavioral changes, but the tumor itself pressed on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which I'll mention a bit in a moment. And they took the tumor out. He didn't look at pornography, didn't touch his stepdaughter, and didn't report any urges to do any of those things. Several years later, he was back inappropriate sexual touching, fantasies, looking at pornography. Diagnosis, saw the tumor again, took it out, the behavior, fantasies, etc., went away. There, I think, unlike Phineas Gage, you think it's not only there's a correlation between what's going on in the mind and the brain. You think not only that perhaps there's counterfactual dependency, namely if you change what's going on in the brain, you change something in the mind and vice versa. You actually think there's a causal relationship. There's a relationship between the growth of the tumor and whatever else it did, like pressing on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and his behavior and perhaps his desires to engage in that behavior as well. My last example is one that in phase 2 of MacArthur we studied, which was volitional incapacity. Antonio Rangel and his team at Caltech have done the following set of experiments starting in Science 2009 and replicated a number of times in the neuroscience journals since. Take a bunch of people who are dieters who really want to lose weight, make them very hungry, and then have a cognitive pretest on what they judge as healthy versus tasty. Then stick them in a scanner and have them make a choice that you can't make them eat in the scanner, they have to do as soon as they get out. And in particular, my weakness is chocolate cake, nice big chocolate cake sitting there as the tasty but not healthy possibility. What does one find? Well, some people eat the cake, some people don't. Everybody has a portion of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex light up, code for have oxygenated blood flow showing activity, light up in the scan, the fMRI, but the ones who eat the cake, i.e. give rise to the gluttonous impulse, don't resist it, do not have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex light up, whereas those whose dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lights up along with the ventral medial actually refrain from eating the cake. Hypothesis. The self-restraint, self-control is located, their hypothesis, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It moderates the signal otherwise coming from the ventromedial down to the supplementary motor area and on down to the motor cortex. There the claim looks like one wants to start talking about not just causation but identity. What it is to control yourself from eating is to have your dorsolateral active in that way. Whatever's going on, it's still a crude physical measure. So I end up with this roughly identity thesis, and if I have time I'll say why it's rough, about the mind and the brain. The mind really is the brain. Now, why does that make one skeptical? I quote in the third page of the libretto from Josh Green, who teaches psychology and philosophy at Harvard. He was also a member of our MacArthur Phase 1 research team. Josh Green, in his lecture to the Society at London, Royal Society at London, the neuroscience doesn't have to be accurate to get rise to the skepticism he thinks will come out of a better and more accurate neuroscience. At some time in the future, he says, we may have extremely high-resolution scanners that can simultaneously track the neural activity and connectivity of every neuron in a human brain, along with computers and software that can analyze and organize these data. Imagine, for example, watching a film of your brain, choosing between soup and salad. The analysis software highlights the neurons pushing for soup in red, so maybe it's tomato soup, you stain that red, and the neurons pushing for salad in blue, think blue cheese dressing or something. You zoom in and slow down the film, allowing yourself to trace the cause and effect relationship between individual neurons. The mind's clockwork revealed in arbitrary detail. You find the tipping point moment at which the blue neurons in your prefrontal cortex outfire the red neurons, seizing control of your premotor cortex and causing you to say, I will have the salad, please. Now, I likened that when I was with Josh. I said, you know, that's like the Kurosawa movie, the Japanese director Kagemusha. Because in Kagemusha, you have these armies with the Japanese paper flags on the back with all the little colors, and there they are, and the skepticism for Green comes out of the fact that it's just the little armies of soldiers, but there's no emperor. I call this the disappearing self intuition. You should see a self down there commanding the neurons, the red ones to win for the soup or the blue ones to win for the salad, and there's no emperor, there's just two valued switches going off, little soldiers with colored things on their back. For that, Green and others think, we're just machines, and that makes them skeptical about us also being moral agents. Second bunch of data, not the mind-brain identity thesis, but data that comes out of the causation of voluntary human choice. Now, there's lots and lots of studies, like the tumor one that I mentioned, but that one doesn't purport to be general. People say, yeah, but he had a tumor. Well, you could say we all have tumors in the sense that we all have causes for our voluntary choices that themselves are not chosen. It shouldn't matter if it's a tumor or not. Kornhuber and Diek, two neuroscientists on the faculty at Freiburg in Breisgau in Germany, in the 60s, had that thought and said, let's see if we can find some causal antecedent to voluntary motor movement that is across the board. It's not for exceptional cases like tumors, it's across the board for all voluntary motor movement. Tricky to do because of the limited apparatus. They were using EEG at the time, not fMRI, electroencephalograms. They were looking for a low negative shift in the electrical potential. They had it on the outside of the skull, but what it was measuring was the supplementary motor area of the brain, which operates ahead of the motor cortex in getting us to act. They found a low negative shift consistent with voluntary motor movement. For certain kinds of movements, a full second. For other kinds of movements, more like a half second, prior to the signal hitting the plates on the muscles that ultimately moved. They called it in German the Bereitschaft potential, the preparedness, usually translated as the readiness potential. Actually, it was a good bit of science to find it, given the fact that the normal rhythms of the brain so outpace the signal they were trying to find that they had to start with a voluntary motor movement and look backward over 25 back averages to find the signal, because you had to get rid of all the noise in order to see it. So that sat there as a finding published in German in 1965 until Benjamin Libet at the University of San Francisco Medical Center, now dead, married his consciousness studies to this finding. Namely, he had been doing consciousness studies about when people are aware of certain things, and paired that with the readiness potential and came up with the finding that I report, namely, people are conscious of willing roughly 300 to 350 milliseconds later than there's a determinate signal in the supplementary motor area showing that they are going to will or going to move or both. That gave rise to quite a discussion in the mid-'80s with respect to whether or not this showed that people didn't have free will, or if they had free will, they didn't have a will that was causally efficacious because it was the co-effect of a common cause, with the basic cause being in the brain and the co-effect being the bodily movements. Either of those would be skepticism. Now, a lot happened since then of people who've done replications of various kinds. The one we studied in MacArthur was the experiments by John Dylan Haynes from Berlin. Haynes wrote 2 short papers with some collaborators in 2007-2008 on 2 valued choices, namely one about bodily movements, left finger, right finger will be moved was the choice. The second was purely a mental action, whether you'll add or subtract numbers after you get the numbers. I was Haynes' commentator when we brought him out to UC Santa Barbara. I asked him if this made him skeptical, and it didn't, but the finding that blows some people away and gives rise to headings like the new mind reader of Germany is that Haynes is up in his best experiments to 79% accuracy on predicting the content of a 2-valued choice 6 to 7 seconds prior to the awareness of the subject of what the choice was. He was looking at blood flow patterns, not in the supplementary motor area, that's too late, much earlier in the precuneus region of the parietal cortex. Again, pretty good accuracy, 79%, on a 2-valued choice, where statistically it would be 50% with regard to what that choice was going to be. So I thought to myself, it doesn't make him skeptical. I wonder about other people. So I sent his articles out to some intelligent lay people. I sent it out to Elizabeth Arthur, well-known novelist who lives and teaches in Ohio. Elizabeth and I used to hike the Himalayas together in the 70s. She immediately shot back, I think this blows your whole system out of the water, Michael. I don't think anything's left of all this work you've done on responsibility. So I tried Carl Dennis, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. He responded by writing me a poem of why no one's responsible for anything, given the causal antecedents of behavior, which I will put into my book. So that convinced me, with my armchair social science of limited data, that this is actually stuff that makes people skeptical. 2 ways in which this kind of data makes people skeptical. One is you're identifying the causal antecedents of choice in areas of the brain that you do not have direct control, either the precuneus region or even the supplementary motor area. And this is making people skeptical because of what I call a determinist argument, to show that the causes of your choices are themselves things outside your control means that ultimately you're not responsible for what you choose because your choices themselves are subject to sufficient causation by brain events. The other skepticism is the epiphenomenal skepticism. It isn't that your choices are caused that makes you skeptical, it is that they do no causing. If it turns out your choice is simply the byproduct of a brain process that is directly causing movement, then it's epiphenomenal. Well, my second daughter was an undergraduate at Berkeley. She used to come in for the word of the week. One week it was epiphenomenal, namely, increasing vocabulary, namely co-effects of a common cause. The willing is the co-effect of the bodily movement and not its cause. That would hurt David Hume's supposition a lot about the ability of our willings to issue in changes in the world that we will. Second form of skepticism. The third data I'll be very quick on. It's where I started in this business. Namely, I think Freud is here. Freud says, you are not master in your own house. Why not? Because you don't know what you think you know. There's a second agent of various kinds and designations, whether it's id, system unconscious, dream sensor, or whatever. There's another agent really going in control. One of his analogies was, you're the rider on the horseback. You've got the reins. He says, I hope you enjoy the view because all you're doing is riding. The horse is going where it wants to go. You have the illusion you're actually controlling it, but your choices are epiphenomenal. In this case, it's the knowledge that's fallible, and the denial of people like Daniel Legner, the psychologist at Harvard, in his classic book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, is that we don't, in fact, know what we're doing or why we're doing it in the way that we think we do. We're not infallible, and we don't even have privileged access. He gives two kinds of examples. Examples where you're acting, but you don't know it. The alien hand syndrome, think Dr. Strangelove in that old movie with Peter Sellers' arm going up. Or Ouija boards where people are actually moving it but don't think they are. Or unconscious nibbling, you find yourself nibbling on the chocolate cake. Tilting when you're over a cliff because you're thinking about falling and that actually makes you lean toward the cliff. Millions of common day examples of that kind. Also examples of the converse kind, where you actually think you're acting, but actually you're not. One of my favorites is confabulation, either after hypnosis or in split brain patients. You make up why it is you did something when actually you didn't have much to do with it. You don't have a clue why you did it. Why I like that study is because they picked some law students to take it. The law students, no surprise, confabulate more than the rest of us. The lawyers are real talkers, thinking sincerely that actually they had something to do with what they did. So that's the three sets of data. If you look at the next part of the outline, the various challenges on page 4, I think the kinds of challenges to responsibility that come out of this kind of data, although the data was clumped into 3, are 4 kinds of challenges. One is the reductionist challenge. We are nothing but neurons, as the New York Times says. We lose the self that could be the responsible moral agent if it turns out that the mental states of belief, desire, and intention that make us practically rational agents are no more than firings of two-valued switches and complex patterns. That's what I think of as the ordinary reductionist kind of challenge. There is a second challenge, and that comes because of the fact that reductions in science are not always what I think of as smooth reductions. They're sometimes lumpy. In fact, so lumpy that sometimes the things being reduced are said not to exist at all. So a smooth reduction, classic philosophy of science example, is the reduction of classical thermodynamics, you know, the stuff you learned in high school chemistry about Boyle's law and Charles' law and Snell's law about the diffusion rate of a gas through a porous membrane. All of that stuff is smoothly reducible to statistical mechanics, the kinetic energy of molecules in motion, made possible by the identification and identity thesis of temperature, the macro property we experience, with the mean kinetic energy of the molecules making up the gas. That's thought to be a smooth reduction with nothing left over. One question is, should that by itself make you skeptical? To which the answer is, why should it? There's still temperature, it just turns out to have a different nature than you might have thought from experiencing it phenomenologically. But the second is more pernicious, what I have down here as eliminative materialism. There are lumpier reductions. It's sometimes said, for example, that mass post-Einstein just doesn't mean what Newton meant by mass. And although you can say, well, Newton's really dealing with mass, it isn't really what he meant. It's a bit of a lumpy reduction. It gets really lumpy when you start moving, thank you, David, to Lavoisier in chemistry, when you say, well, did what the pre-Lavoisier chemists mean by phlogiston, is that really what we're referring to as oxygen? Is it really roughly the same thing? To which the answer of most people is no, phlogiston doesn't exist. The attributes that made it phlogiston is just too far removed from oxygen for you to say that you have reduced phlogiston to oxygen. It doesn't exist as the preferred scientific or chemist's response. There are those about the folk psychology, particularly people whose name is Churchland, Paul and Patricia, who teach out at UC San Diego, but many who follow, who think that the folk psychology, particularly in its aspect of intentionality, its directedness upon an object, has characteristics that no physical system could realize. And if that were the case, if the reduction were that lumpy, and if the conclusion therefore was there really were no belief, desire, or intention states, that looks like it would make one very skeptical indeed. So a second kind of reductionist challenge coming from a physicalism, but one with a very lumpy reduction rather than a smooth one. With determinism, there's a 2,000-year-old set of discussions about determinism. A good colleague, good friend of mine, Kadri Vivalian at USC in the philosophy department, has the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy trying to taxonomize all the ways in which people think determinism is a threat to freedom and to responsibility. She has quite a list. I actually think in my own decades-long study, there are really only two things that in the popular mind make it seem like a threat that somebody has found a physical cause in the brain of your choices. One of those is a thesis about causation and possibility. The thesis is if something you don't control causes your choice in the strong Millian sense of cause, it's a sufficient condition, then it couldn't have been otherwise, given the causal antecedents, that you chose what you did. You had to choose what you did. You had no real choice. And on the principle that you're not responsible if you couldn't have done or chosen other than you did or chose, nobody's responsible. It's not a tumor. It's always the case that no one is responsible because of sufficient causation. Sufficiency of causation of your choice shows an incapacity or an inability to have chosen other than you did, and that makes us universally not responsible. I think that is the strongest intuition that governs this skeptical view about neuroscience's discovery of causes of choice. The second one I think is murkier. It is this intuition that persons are special kinds of agents in the world. It is true we use the English language to talk about acids like sulfuric acid dissolved the zinc, or the tree shed its leaves. We use the active mood of English for objects that are not persons, but the thesis is persons shed their clothes in a way that trees do not shed their leaves. For persons to have the agency requires that they be uncaused in their causings, unlike inanimate objects. How exactly one shows that is a bit of a mystery for the people who are in philosophy called the source incompatibilists, but nonetheless that I take it to be the basis of their skepticism, separate from the conditionalists who think that because you could not have done otherwise, you're not responsible. So I think the determinist challenges boil down to those two. The epiphenomenal challenges are, remember that the willing does no causing. An old answer, Arthur Danto, Columbia, DeLibbet and company in the mid-80s, was but who said willings need to be fully conscious for the entire time that they exist? Why isn't the readiness potential showing up in the supplementary motor area 350 milliseconds prior to consciousness the onset of willing? Why isn't that a perfect location for it? To which some people would say, well, if that's true, then it puts willing out of the dangler position on an epiphenomenal fork into a causal position with the readiness potential as the cause of the movements. But it doesn't put, second epiphenomenal skepticism, it doesn't put consciousness of willing into a causal position, and now consciousness is epiphenomenal. And on the supposition that for you to be responsible, it isn't just for your will to have effect, it's your conscious will. You need knowledge and not just will to be responsible is the thesis. Second, epiphenomenal skepticism. Even if willing causes the movement willed, consciousness of willing does not. It is simply co-effects of the common cause. Second form of skepticism. Fallibilism comes in a weak and a strong version. The weak thesis, we're not infallible. Our mental states are not transparent to us. If you're in pain, you don't have to know you're in pain. We're not incorrigible. If you believe you're in pain, you're not necessarily in pain. Put together, you're not infallible in either direction. Mental states are neither transparent nor are your beliefs incorrigible about them. That, I think, is actually true, and I don't think it took Freud to see it. I think the novelists before Freud had lots of descriptions and ascriptions of motivations and desires of which the people were not aware. It didn't take the psychoanalytic couch when people shout, "I am not angry," at their therapist to reveal that actually people have unconscious mental states, unconscious experience. The tougher one is the strong thesis, Wagner. You don't have privileged access. Not only are you not infallible, but you don't have a privileged way of knowing your mental states, your mind, or the causal etiology of your actions as opposed to anyone else. So we end up with, I think, 4 kinds of skepticism, nicely and perhaps over neatly packaged into 2 variations each. The last part, the 4th topic, is how we doing on these kinds of challenges. Now, as I said in Australia last week, well, that's why you should buy the book. But we've got 10 minutes, so let me tell you where it comes down. One of the students I was having lunch with said, yeah, get to the bottom line. What's the answer? Well, if you can't stand the suspense, here's where it's going to come out. You want to divide your questions as you assess each of these 4 challenges in their 2 iterations each. Okay, 8 challenges. You want to assess each of these challenges by asking 2 quite separate questions. One is the scientific thesis on which the challenge is based plausible, or even better, true? The second question is, does it matter to the assessment of responsibility or to the way we conceive of ourselves as moral agents, whether it's true? Now, I came across these 2 questions a lot of years ago, but I did find amusing an anecdote that Nick Sturgeon, who teaches philosophy at Cornell, told me some years ago and ultimately published. You always wonder when you give a big lecture what your graduate students, who are your teaching assistants, are saying in the discussion section about your lecture to the undergraduates. Well, Nick had this silly idea of go listening at the door and heard that his graduate student was taking his entire lecture on metaethics and dividing it into 2 things. One was, oh yeah, and the other was, so what? Good graduate student, not respectful, but great graduate student, right? 2 questions about anything. Is it true, and does it matter to anything you care about whether it's true? Ask those 2 questions about these skeptical challenges, and I think, the bottom at the end of the day, with one or the other of them, you can diffuse the skepticism. Let's just see how it goes for a bit. Take the first one about reductionism. Make it the ordinary, smooth, non-lumpy reduction. Suppose it turns out that we can find that intentions are a discrete state. Doesn't have to be localized, could be system-wide, but suppose it's localized in the parietal cortex, certain sorts of goings-on. Suppose that's the identity that we, in fact, discover. Is that plausible? Is it true? Well, what are the alternatives? Really only 2, if you think largely at least, come to mind. One is a kind of dualism, where the self, as an entity that really exists in its own mode of existence in time but not in space and not possessing energy, nonetheless has some kind of control over brain events, usually thought of as a kind of dualism. Now, there are dualists in philosophy, but those are not people who've actually tried to make it work. Sir John Eccles, the Nobel Prize winner, tried to make it work. After 75, he said, I stopped doing experiments and I started doing philosophy. So I regularly teach his book, How the Self Controls Its Brain, because it presents in a detail that ultimately I think reduces to absurdity what you'd have to think to think of a non-physical energy not violating the laws on the conservation of mass and energy, controlling a brain which has mass, physical location, and energy. He's got lots of things to say. This is a smart guy. But as you look at his 40 million psychons, correlating one-to-one with his 40 million dendrons, which are bundles of neurons, and work through the lines he calls the mind-brain interface, I think most people say this is hopeless. So I was in the Hall of Eccles last week, and I asked the neuroscientists doing the work on synaptic crossings post-Eccles, how many of you followed the Eccles move post-75 into a kind of dualism? The director finally shut me down later in the day saying, would you stop that? You're just embarrassing us. There was one guy, but he was a Buddhist, who actually did think this. But otherwise, what Gazzaniga says, 99.9% of neuroscientists are not dualists, for good reason. Look at what you'd have to think in books like that of Eccles, and you're not a dualist. So that alternative doesn't look so good. The one that is most popular amongst philosophers, I think, is a non-reductive physicalism, what my friend David Armstrong, who taught philosophy at Sydney, used to call the ontological free lunch. Namely, you're just a physicalist, all there really is the brain, but nonetheless, arising from the brain are certain functional states or modes of organization or something that you think of as mental states. That I think to be equally challenging with a straight reductionism, where just mechanical systems is the base ontological view. And the question is, should that make you skeptical? The answer is, why should it? Are you skeptical about temperature once you know the mean kinetic energy of molecules is what temperature is that you're experiencing? Are you skeptical about water once you see that it's H2O? Why would a smooth reduction make one skeptical? It's a nice book by Bill Bechtel, who teaches out at UC San Diego, a philosopher who's turned neuroscientist, saying all you have to do is not make the Josh Green mistake. Don't think small, think big. When you're looking for the self, don't look for the emperor in the Japanese movie Down with the Neurons. The emperor is the whole package of neurons. It's the battlefield, it's not the warriors. And stay large when you're looking for the self. There's no reason on earth to go homuncular and start looking for little selves. That's a bankrupt philosophy, a bankrupt psychology. So I don't think reductionism is going to turn out to be a challenge. So notice, do I think it's true? Yes, in any sense in which I care about. Do I think it matters to responsibility? Don't think so. I think the converse is the set of answers to eliminative materialism, skeptical reductions. Namely, if it really turned out that beliefs were individuated in a way by their objects referring to real-world things that are not in the head, in a way that made you say there's no such things as beliefs, I do think we would be in a quandary as to what to think with regard to responsibility and how to conceive of ourselves. Lose the BDI psychology, belief, desire, intention psychology, it is really a puzzle. Indeed, whether anything like what we think of as moral responsibility would survive. Fortunately, I think, and that's mostly a philosophical issue, not a neuroscience issue, fortunately, I think that one is going to be false. It would matter if it were true. Hopefully, it's not true. With regard to the determinisms, is this a deterministic system? This brain, can't imagine it's not. I and Robert Kane, who teaches philosophy at Texas, combine our philosophy seminars. Once in a while, he comes up to Illinois and I go down to Texas, and we go back and forth on his libertarian views. He's not a dualist, but he is a libertarian. Choices are free, but you don't need some stuff in which they're free separate from the brain. And he's got some, he goes to quantum theory and thinks that it's just possible there are some membranes where quantum indeterminacy can enter into the very tipping points, so you only get probabilities, not causal determination on choices. I think that's possible, but we don't need to do it. Nothing that neuroscience can show us about causation will ever show us we're not responsible agents. I think that's true about any form of causation, not just neuroscience, genetics, behaviorism, even if dynamic psychiatry were right, Freud's unconscious. That we are caused does not make us unable to do other than we did. Now that's a paper in itself, which some of you, at least one of you, has read, which is what do we mean by incapacity? Well, we don't mean lack of sufficient causation. Suppose you're a track coach. You have a star track student who in fact could win a race of a certain kind. He didn't win. You say to him after he didn't win, you could have won the race. you do not mean there were no causes sufficient for you to lose it. You mean you would have won if you really had tried harder, or if you'd lengthened your stride like I told you, or if you'd not been out the night before with your girlfriend, etc. In a possible world very close to the actual world, you would have won is what I mean by saying you could have won on that occasion. I do not mean you were free of sufficient causation. If you do the philosophy of ability, I think the intuition that because you're sufficiently caused, you don't control that which is caused will evaporate. Now, a lot of philosophers believe that. There is a double task in lectures like this, which is it's not enough that we philosophers get the pure philosophical air distilled right. It is also the case that if people believe what is shown by philosophers to be false, it'll be just as bad as if it were true. If people come to believe they're not responsible, it's going to be like Dostoevsky with God, right? Kill off God and everything is permitted. Well, some of us write papers called Morality Without God, Good Without God. For philosophers, that's great, but if people believe God is necessary for morality, they're going to behave badly when you kill God off. And the same could be true here. Even if you show that neuroscience in its causal aspects is fully compatible with responsibility, you do need people to believe it, otherwise they may in fact degrade their sense of themselves and behave poorly. Epiphenomenalism, if it were true, it would be devastating. If we need conscious willing and it's in the epiphenomenal position, we would be in trouble. I think the answers to the German studies through Libet and Haynes is that epiphenomenalism, in any significant sense, will turn out to be false. An old example is, why would you think that temporal order is any evidence whatsoever as to what is and outside of a causal chain? Even if willing, even if consciousness of willing, whatever the intermediate variable is, occurs after some earlier events, why do you think it's not in the causal chain between the earlier events and the bodily movements? An example of a friend of mine is you light a fuse at T1, the fuse burns at T2, and an explosion goes off at T3. Because the burning of the fuse succeeded in time the lighting of the fuse is no argument whatsoever that it's not in the causal chain between the first event and the last event. It's simply a causal intermediary. And if the challenge is epiphenomenalism and not determinism, it's not a ground of thinking that something is epiphenomenal, that it succeeds in time, this alleged co-cause. One needs much more determinate data showing why willing or why consciousness of willing could not occur in the areas, such as the readiness potential and the like, in which the physical stuff is going on. With regard to fallibilism, I do think that neither Freud nor what they call themselves, the psychologist of the new unconscious, title of one of their books, surely we're not infallible and nobody thought that we were. Do we have privileged access? Fortunately, I think we do, because we do need it. I think it defines our self-boundaries. If we didn't have that kind of privileged access, we couldn't distinguish between what philosophers of mind for decades have been calling a difference between the personal states, the states true of you as a person, and the subpersonal states that are functionally defined subroutines by virtue of which you are able to do the personal things that you're able to do. But those are personal because you have privileged access to them. That one I think is important. So for those of you who can't stand to wait for the book to come out, the bottom line is going to be, I think we're okay. It's not guaranteed, but I think between the two questions, it either won't matter or it isn't likely to be true. I think responsibility and our self-conception survives. I do think we have two sort of major challenges of contemporary science as has infected the popular mind. One is the remarkable stuff in physics, from Maxwell's equations to string theory. I think people are absolutely fascinated. The number of people who know about the Higgs boson is absolutely stunning. Front page news, right, on the discovery of that stuff. I think neuroscience is the second great scientific frontier that has penetrated popular consciousness. It is interesting that both of these have threatened to make us think less of ourselves. So we get books like Tom Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, that combines them both, and with some drastic metaphysics tells us we're actually going to be okay. Well, I take those to be symptomatic of felt challenges from both of those pieces of science. My lecture has been about the second and not the first, although in a way it really is about whether, as the physicists say, physics is a theory of everything. Even if it is, I think we're still responsible agents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have 25 minutes or thereabouts for questions. We can be ready to take them.
I and my brain will do my best.
Okay, very good.
Adina?
Thanks for that. That was a great talk, and I wish I could disagree with you more, but I pretty much agree with everything that you said, except in your setup, I was surprised that you took all forms of justice to be challenged by the brain science. So I've always conceived of it as retributive justice that's really the kind of justice at stake, but not that any time justice is invoked, it's going to be challenged by brain science. So could you explain?
Well, sweet of you to try to find something we could disagree about. Adina used to sit next to me at these MacArthur Foundation meetings, and when Josh Green would speak, we'd both be wagging our head. And finally, Josh came up to me once after he'd made some particularly ameliorative response to our criticism. And I said, Josh, you didn't drink enough coffee this morning? What are you doing? He says, Michael, do you know what a burden it is to say something the two of you will hate every time you speak? So she and I agree on a lot. Sweet of you to try to find something. So you took the Sapolsky line, retributive justice looks particularly vulnerable. But think through the other kinds of justice that are plausible. Since Aristotle, corrective justice. You come into my house and break my Ming vase, say intentionally because you don't have one, pure envy. I take it Aristotle's pretty persuasive in saying, because you culpably caused the damage to me, you now have a secondary moral duty of correction, namely you need to correct it by compensating. You might also have a retributive justice duty, but leave that out. Don't you have a corrective justice duty, but doesn't that depend on the same suppositions about morality? A voluntary act, causing a harm, no justification, no excuse, culpable state of mind, sound moral agent, so forth and so on, exactly as does retributive justice. And even though the called for response, the secondary duty, is different, it's not the duty to suffer of retributive justice, it's the duty to compensate of corrective justice. The trigger looks mighty similar, which means the psychological suppositions the same. Now do the same for John Locke's theory of property. You have a natural right to property according to Locke when you mix your labor with a thing. Your natural property is the human body. When you in fact mix the body which you were at liberty to use or not to create something of value, you're entitled to a property right in that thing so long as much and as good is left for others, the Lockean argument. That presupposes certain states about you that are the mirror image of the states with regard to culpability assessment, namely, we're now going to give you a carrot rather than a stick. But the condition of deserved carrot receipt will look a lot like the conditions of deserved stick receipts, even though it's praise and not blame. So that too looks like it has those suppositions built into it. Promissory justice, I think, the same. You may be right about distributive justice. Distributive justice for some only presupposes a need and not, if it doesn't have any luck egalitarianism built into it, it doesn't presuppose the same sorts of conditions. That might be right about at least Rawls's extremely egalitarian view of distributive justice. Yep.
Can you speak more about the self being like the whole brain as opposed to consuming it too much, like you say Reed does?
Yeah. It's just a mistake to go homuncular, is the usual way people put that. To think that if you look somewhere you can find an executive agency, like a whole person. It's the sort of mistake Freud makes when he starts dividing structurally in the metapsychology in 1923 between ego, id, and superego. As Dan Dennett used to say, Freud's mistake was to make one way too smart general. What you want are some really dumb switchmen. All they can do is pull a two-valued switch. But if you have a homunculus in there, then you've got this agent with full personal attributes, and you want to know how does that work, and you get a regress of little people inside of little people. National Film Board of Canada put out a film decades ago that used to be used in abnormal sight classes of the little man inside the brain, and he had a little man inside that guy's brain, and of course all the way down to point of invisibility. So you don't want to go that way. It's got to be that the system as a whole is where the selfhood is realized. Now, you don't think everything that goes on in the brain probably instantiates the attributes of self. But that's the problem about mind-brain research in general. As I said to these physiologists last week, how do you distinguish in all of those amazingly detailed structural pictures you're drawing what it is that encodes information and what's just noise? What is just, this is how this piece of equipment happens to work, versus the structures you're looking at are essential for it to functionally function as it does. That's something that only some experimentation will show. So it may be much of what goes on in the brain we don't need for the self, but I take that to be a scientific question. Once you get clear in your own head, the self isn't some small executive agency somewhere in the brain. That's a non-starter. And even if it's not the whole brain, it's going to be a system-wide or good enough correlation once you make clear in your own mind what the self is. Bill Bechtel's book on neuroscience called Mechanism and the Brain basically says, well, the self has 4 attributes. Well, that's what you have to do. You have to get some sense of what you're looking for and then talk about the whole brain realizing it. Now, there are some neuroscientists and philosophers who are trying to make much of what they call the mereological fallacy, which is the confusing of a part with the whole. And their argument is you can't say the brain does anything, only they say whole persons do things. So the person, well, I guess let's see. The person loves another person. If you say my brain loves another person, that seems to have lost something of its meaning. And of course, if you go to the whole body and say my body loves you, you actually shift the meaning considerably. But nonetheless, there's supposed to be this mereological fallacy of substituting brains for persons. And I asked those people like Hacker and Pardo and Dennis Patterson, what's the whole then? If this is a fallacy of attributing an attribute of the whole to a part, what's the whole of which is no longer a fallacy? And there they go mysterious. What is a person? Well, not the whole body. If it's not the whole brain, what are they talking about? So I think you need the right sizing. The attributes we think of as essential for a self are mental attributes. Their physical location will be the brain. It needn't be everything that goes on in the brain, but some subset of those portions remains to be discovered which. Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit, by the way, I agree with a lot of your view, I agree with lots of your view, if not all of it. But one of the second points is this: if the world's going along as it is, and how is it possible we could have done otherwise? And that's always the question. It seems to me if you could have done otherwise, you say, well, that'd be a good grounds for holding someone accountable, and not and then punishing them. But if we couldn't have done otherwise, the punishment just seems kind of mean. So how do you explicate the notion of could have done otherwise?
Well, it's someone calls, Peter van Inwagen in philosophy calls that the hardest question in philosophy. I don't know if it's hard, but it's worthy of attention. Because it's so tempting to think, if you're sufficiently caused to choose soup over salad, well, you couldn't have chosen the salad in some sense. It's tempting to think that, and yet misleading, because we don't seem to use the modalities of could that way. I gave you the example of the track star, where you plainly don't mean he's free of sufficient causation if he could have. You don't mean that. You know he's sufficiently caused. You just mean if the world were just a little bit different, he would have behaved differently. He would have thus done something otherwise. So it's what's usually thought of as the reductionist or counterfactual analysis of ability. What we mean by ability has nothing to do with sufficient causation. Once you accept that, you erode this intuition. Now, is there even a sense in which he couldn't have done otherwise? Perhaps. Maybe English is large enough to allow this incompatibilist sense that if it's sufficiently caused, then in that sense of the word, he couldn't have done otherwise. Then the question is, what's the morally relevant sense of could have done otherwise? So let me give you a homely example. So when I was a young professor, I was teaching at the University of Kansas. We had an older professor for whom he had a kind of idée fixe. The biggest thing that ever happened in his life was he had worked for Harry Truman. So he had about 4 or 5 Truman stories, and once you'd heard them in great laborious detail, they became very boring. He couldn't remember that he told them, so he would tell them. So here was the game. As a young faculty member, see who can make the vaguest allusion to Truman and still elicit one of the 4 or 5 boring stories. You couldn't do Independence, Missouri. That's way too easy. It had to be something subtle, whistle stop or something, and then get this response. Now, it didn't take much to cause him to tell the boring story. But on the assumption that boring your colleagues at lunch is a punishable offense, which it isn't in most places, but it should be, then he's guilty, even though we caused him to tell the boring story. We would be, in law, accomplices. We'd be accessories before the fact, but that doesn't relieve him of responsibility for making his choice. Now, could he have chosen otherwise? Well, he was older, and this was the biggest thing that happened in his life, so you may think he was hardwired. But I tested it with him one day, because the second big thing in his life was that as a senior professor, he was assigned to teach legal writing, which is, in law schools, a very low-level position, unworthy of a senior professor. And he was fixated on that as well. So one day at lunch, I tried the following sentence. I said, did you know that Harry Truman once taught legal writing? Now, you might have thought the wires would cross and he'd just blow up. But actually, he said, oh, really? I didn't. How would he do that? He wasn't, he didn't go to law. So he actually engaged in a sensible discussion. We neither got the boring stories nor the repetitive whining about teaching legal writing. So I made the judgment he could have done better. Not that I didn't cause him, but he could have done better on each occasion. He didn't have to whine, and he didn't have to tell the same boring stories. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you, in all of your thought processes, think about the soul. It seems to me that defining words often depend on your point of view, and if you're on one end of the spectrum, brain and mind are almost equivalent, and if you're on another end of that spectrum, self and mind become a little more equivalent. Where is the soul in the discussion, if at all, and do you define
Well,
that?
for me, I want to get rid of the religious connotations. I don't believe in identity conditions for something called a soul that survives the human body. So I don't come from a tradition that has any preconceived designs about getting the answer to that perhaps others do. Soul, for me, if I were to ever use the word, which I try not to, I would simply think of as the mind or the psyche. Usually people, when they do soul, have some rather heavier duty metaphysics in mind. And since I have always eschewed those, my parents sent me to remedial Bible class at 6 because they didn't understand how a 6-year-old could be such a committed atheist. Didn't do any good. I'm still here. Do you mean by soul something of a religious kind that gives you an afterlife?
I agree with you. I think I equate it to mind, but that's because I'm coming from that point of the spectrum. And I'm wondering, if the people who think of mind and brain as more equivalent don't even have use for that in their vocabulary. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I think people eschew its use because it tends to have these religious connotations of there being something that survives the physical brain, an afterlife. I do, in my philosophy classes, I do have a picture from the Canadian Weekly, something like that. It's one of those supermarket tabloids they sell in Canada. And it's the first ever picture of a human soul. And it's a woman dying on the operating table and with a really good high-speed lens. They captured a sort of figure of her arising from her body, and they weighed her before and after and found there was just a couple grams, micrograms of difference. That's sort of like Eccles' dualism, isn't it? I mean, you raise it just because you say, if that's the picture, it can't be. Can't be. Right? I mean, it cannot be the case that there are literal ghosts in the machines, ghosts that have the capacity to cause things. They can hit you with a rock, but then you throw the rock back at them and it goes right through them. I don't know any physics that can explain that stuff. So I'm afraid the soul probably gets, I guess my wife is my soulmate, but I don't think I'm committed to anything beyond this life for that. Yeah.
So I guess we talk a lot about the self. Do you think that it's something that is developed over time, or it's something right when someone's born or this mind starts out that there's some sort of innate feature that creates the self? And I guess more so that, what is it that's unique about humans that would allow them to have a self, whereas a bug flying around isn't thinking of how it's looking or anything else of that nature?
Yeah, I actually think it's a contingent achievement to have a self, and it could be otherwise, and if you listen to the neuroscientists enough, it might be otherwise. So I do think it takes the unification of different of your states still being of you. It takes the reflection that is self-consciousness to actually create this self, and I do take it to be a smooth evolution between creatures with some primary awareness to creatures with what we have, what we think of as self-consciousness. And presumably there are states beyond ours. So I do think the self is, as I say, a kind of achievement of persons that is nonetheless contingent. It make people think they're machines enough, they might actually lose their sense of self. If you look at some of the psychiatric conditions that some of the late psychoanalysts like Heinz Kohut used to study, borderline personality or narcissistic personality disorders, those are people who, as he diagnosed them, lost their sense of self. They didn't have good self-boundaries vis-a-vis the world, but even worse, they didn't have a unified sense of self. And those were pretty sick people. And I take it to be a contingent feature of humanity that we're not like that, most of us, most of the time.
So if we accept that these advances in neuroscience don't actually, or shouldn't perhaps affect how our judicial systems, which, if I understood you correctly, was your position, how do the effects of systems on a scale larger than a person, like a country or economical systems or what have you, at what point do those start becoming culpable for the actions of individuals? And I suppose, to relate it to your story, at what point do we start blaming Harry Truman's cult of personality for the boring stories?
Yeah, that's a natural extension to move from little people to big people, right? Ordinary-sized people are you and me, and then there's the little people, the homunculi within us, and then the big people, which are the social groupings. I'm a methodological individualist. I don't think that groups have moral properties like rights and responsibilities. I think they're useful abbreviations for holding individuals responsible. But take the classic case in which this is debated, the Indiana prosecution of Ford Motor Company. As a company, not the individuals, they were separately prosecuted, but as a company for having a corporate culture such that they could do the cost-benefit calculation of not recalling the Pinto at the known cost of whatever it was, 400 and some lives. There's the famous memo, which didn't get into the trial, although one of my partners in law in San Francisco was seating second seat on that. He had studied too much law and economics. He actually tried to get it in. The memo, you may recall, said the following: if we don't recall the Pinto, it'll cost 400 and something extra lives, but it's a cheap car. Most of those people are housewives, and we cost them out at about $70,000 a pop. And you get a figure. And then the cost of recall was in excess of that figure, so the economically rational thing is not to do the recall. It shows you, for those of you here at the Rockefeller Center who have an economist for a director, the dangers of too much economics. As a jury argument, that was a dead loser. in any event, the question of the emergence of Ford as an actor above and beyond its officers, I think the law has instrumental reasons for treating it like an actor, because you can get certain incentive effects trickling down to individuals that you might want. But as for it really being an actor, now there is this strange fellow. He teaches out at Trinity College in Texas. And it's odd to me that I always repress his name. He and I had a public debate on corporate responsibility. He literally believes corporations have a centralized decision structure that makes them fundamental moral agents just like you and me. Now, I understand the argument. No individual within the company has the full range of functions that makes the culpable decision. In ignorance of each other, various officers make various componential decisions, the result of which is the Pinto's not recalled and 400 and some people died. But do you really think those are moral agents? So I gave him this hypothetical. I said, suppose you're a lawyer and time is short. You can only do one of two things. There's a person, one of these flesh and blood types, drowning in a lake. You can go save her. Or there's a corporation that is going to be dissolved downtown. One of them has to die. The corporation by being dissolved or the person in the lake. You telling me this is a close question as to which you do? Are they really persons and moral agents, the center of moral interests? I think that's not, it's not nonsense literally. I do think morally it's wrong. I don't think we have that kind of group accountability. It is true, if you like science fiction, that in Star Trek, second series, if the Borg really existed, so that you got plugged into that spaceship with just simple functions, there's no reason on Earth, in principle, you couldn't be a brain, part of a brain, right? In which event you would have true group responsibility. Corporations are not remotely like that, and neither are nation states, not even China.
I'm a little reluctant to try and bring this back to practical. I don't think you would punish the man with the brain tumor, but let me check that. And so where on the continuum, if we can say...
It's a great test case.
Okay.
Because actually, I didn't say enough for me to make that judgment, and you shouldn't be making it yet either.
Yeah, but I teach legal ethics, so.
So let's see how it goes. Suppose you grant the neurologist's hypothesis, I think, to be true. The tumor, or at least what the tumor caused by pressing on various things, caused him to have the desires that he didn't have before of a sexual kind. Let's suppose that's true. Is that enough to let him off the hook? I think the answer to that one is a flat no. We all have desires caused by factors we did not control. The genetics and environmental variables that produce what it is we desire are all things over which in the immediate case we have limited control, and in the long-term case have ultimately go far enough back, no control whatsoever. So that you are raised in a ghetto of a certain kind gives rise to desires of a certain kind. Responsibility for what I'm going to call compatibilists exists for the choices you make on the desires, not for the having of the desires. So he chose to act on those desires. He's like Patty Hearst, the heiress who was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army and emerged as Tanya the Revolutionary. Once you give her the chance to integrate her newfound beliefs and desires into her pre-existing character structure, and she acts on them, then that she is not responsible for where they came from does not impact on her responsibility. But in the case of the tumor, it may turn out the tumor pressing on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex actually incapacitates her and truly makes it the case she couldn't have done otherwise, and you don't mean she was sufficiently caused in her desires. So one of the behavioral ways you test this is as old as Kant in the Second Critique. Kant says, ask if someone can do something. Somebody who says, I couldn't resist the lovely woman, my lust overcame me. Put an executioner across the street, tell him he will be executed immediately if he in fact yields to his lustful impulses, and let's see how he does. Kant's thesis. he could have done otherwise if he would do otherwise if he wanted to badly enough, right? The counterfactual reading of ability. So in the case of the man with the tumor, if you make his conditions really aversive, so he really wants not to yield to those impulses, how would he do? Now, it turns out we had some behavioral evidence here. One of the things we discussed in MacArthur in phase 2 was whether we could use the law to do the dirty work that you can never get by a committee on human experimentation. Because the law, bless its heart, does nasty things to people, and if you can threaten them with the law's sanctions, you can do things you can't otherwise get through human experimentation, like parole revocations, urine tests for drugs, and so forth. In this instance, the law was threatening him with time in the pen, revocation of his parole, if he got kicked out of the behavior modification therapy that he was in, and they had told him he'd get kicked out if he couldn't keep his hands off the nurses. He wanted, as much as he wanted anything, it looked like, not to get kicked out of the program, lose his job, end up in the state pen. He still kept touching the nurses. In addition to the neuroscientific evidence about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that looks like pretty good behavioral evidence that in the relevant sense of could not have, he could not have done other than he did. How do we know that? Because he didn't do other than he did when he really, really wanted to. I don't think we can ask for more than that. Maybe the stern Prussians who lived with Kant could have a sterner test, but even Kant. If you actually would go for the woman despite the executioner, all well and good, then you really couldn't have done otherwise, because you wouldn't have done otherwise even when you really wanted to. But notice that's not a causal fact. That's a counterfactual fact, a fact about what we mean by incapacity that is not triggered by sufficient causation. If you leave it just that his desires were caused, so's yours, so's mine. We're responsible anyway. That's the full story.
Professor Moore, thank you very much for an excellent lecture and a very lively discussion.
Thank you. Thanks.